Welcome to the Health System CIO show. I'm your host, founder, and editor-in-chief, Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Phil Englert, VP of Medical Device Security with the Health-ISAC. Phil, thanks for joining me today.
Hello, Anthony. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to chatting with you. This is quite a topic. It couldn't be more timely. It gets more timely every day to the consternation of CISOs out there. Things just get more interesting every day as we see what the LLMs are coming out with and all this kind of stuff. So fascinating. Looking forward to having a chat with you. If you want to start off by telling me about your organization and your role.
Sure. So the Health-ISAC, and ISAC stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Center, is a global member-driven organization that enables healthcare stakeholders. And there are 1,300 organization members in our group, and we share cyber and physical threat intelligence. It serves medical device manufacturers, healthcare providers, pharma, public health, insurers, payers. So we have the entire spectrum of what is the critical infrastructure of healthcare delivery in there. So, and we really just, our purpose is to facilitate trusted collaboration and real-time information exchange amongst our members, whether that's, InfoSec data, whether that's best practices, whether that's advice around, what tools we're using and what vendors are providing great services. So we do a lot of that. A lot of it is member driven. We have over 26, I think, member-driven work groups and committees that span everything from medical devices, which I lead, through IAM. We've stood up a quantum group. We've got an AI group. So we're doing a lot of good work, leaning into, the expertise that our members have, the sharing that they have. It's there. So, and our core mission is really to strengthen the overall resilience of the healthcare ecosystem, through collective defense and really shared situational awareness. So as the medical device security leader for the Health-ISAC, I really bring together manufacturers of medical devices, healthcare delivery organizations to drive secure and clinically aligned solutions. So I'm really a moderator. I help them have these conversations, figure out where they are. We bring expertise. We raise the level of the bar. We have 3 groups to serve our global community. So we have a European Council, an Americas Council, and then a Western Pacific Council to do that. And we drive a lot of work through that. We're doing right now a product security KPIs, both paper or effort at both the executive level and also at the product security level. We're also working with healthcare providers to understand what their, let's say, minimum requirements for medical device security are, to make sure that medical device manufacturers are aligned with what the providers are asking for and looking for in the future. So we have a lot of good work around that. So, and I'm really proud to lead a smart, engaged, and active organization.
That's wonderful, Phil. I want to make sure we hit this at the right level because I want to be useful to the health system CISOs out there. And what that means is that obviously if we were targeting a different audience, we would cover certain things, more baseline things about why medical devices need certain treatment. But we're speaking to people who know that, so we don't really need to cover that ground. Let's
Gotcha.
try and make sure we hit this at the right level. Given that context, what do you think, like right now, is sort of top of mind for healthcare CISOs? What are the main things they're grappling with? I mean, and we've got, just like HISAC is focused on cybersecurity at a high level, and you've carved out medical device security for some of the reasons, as I said, we don't need to go into an exhaustive detail because the audience knows what they are about: inability to patch and operating systems outliving, the patch cycles. Don't touch it or you break it type thing, all that stuff. So given that context and the people we're targeting, what are they working on and grappling with right now?
So one of the challenges with the healthcare infrastructure, whether it's med devices, whether it's clinical applications, whether it's interfaces to business partners, is just the depth and span of all of those connections. And if we think about all the boundaries that need to be protected, that's the thing. We're looking at, for healthcare CISOs, that we anticipate at the end or within May for the new HIPAA security rules that will move a lot of things that are recommended to must-haves. Things like risk assessments, things like having a full inventory of everything, all of your devices, not just med devices, but the OT technology, that supports healthcare delivery, as well as the clinical applications, and that. So, or healthcare delivery organizations will be asked to map their PHI throughout, from generation, much of it on medical devices, through where it leaves their organization or where it's stored in their organization. So that will be a big challenge. It's kind of a new parameter here, not unnecessary, but they'll have to do regular pen testing and regular risk assessments of their network. So these are burdens that are real, and they're going to require deliberate planning and resourcing to accommodate that. So those, I think, are the big challenges healthcare CISOs and CIOs, as they're doing, are bringing this in. The other thing that I think is important to understand, particularly around technology, is we've had some regulatory changes that's gotten more consistent. What we're beginning to see is health systems, putting cyber requirements into their equipment RFPs and making decisions, excluding equipment that doesn't meet the standards that carry them into the future. And if we think about it, that's the only way we're going to overcome, the legacy infrastructure, is replace it with technologies that will take us the 10, 12, 15, even 20 years down the road that medical devices or other technologies in our environment survive.
All right, lots of great stuff there, Phil. First off, sounds like a lot of what drives these kind of things is regulation, compliance issues, and things like that. The HIPAA security rules revision. Do you know off the top of your head where we are with that, in terms of comments, proposal? How far are we away from officially a new HIPAA security rule? You may not know that, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
So the last I heard, and there was a session on it earlier in April, and they expected to have the report out or the new rules out in May. They didn't
Oh,
define a date, so we're 10 days till the end of May, so it's quite possible they make that. But I think, at the very least, the end of the summer is a realistic expectation.
so this would be, when this drops, this would be one of the biggest things to hit the industry from a cyber point of view in a long time. Is that a right assessment?
I think it is fair because it's across the board. It affects a lot of different caregivers. If you think about healthcare, often people think about the 6,000 hospitals that are present in the US, but there's probably more than 500,000, care providers, whether it's your dentist's office, private physician practices, clinical labs, pharmacies, neighborhood pharmacies, and that. So there's a lot of folks that are really under resourced, to manage this kind of regulation at scale. And it will be interesting to see how the industry responds and adapts and adopts to this.
All right, that's perfect. Let's go into some of the what I might think are the more challenging aspects of what might come out that you mentioned in those rules. When we talk about risk assessments and penetration testing, that doesn't scare me. And again, I'm no CISO, but I've spoken to a lot of them. So I would say risk assessment, pen testing, that's something you can hire a vendor to do. Doesn't scare me, doesn't make me stay up at night. Inventory scares me. Getting a full inventory of what I have, that's a little scary. That sounds like a big project, and I might need some outside help. That would scare me, especially when we're talking about medical devices and operational technology. Let's take that one first. Is that scary?
It is scary. It's a big job, and there's a lot of unknowns in there, but there's also been a great maturity of, the active and passive monitoring capabilities within the healthcare sector.
Right,
And these passive tools have gotten very good
right,
at identifying devices, so that's a big plus. And they're not just looking at medical devices, they're also looking at OT devices. There are companies that have come out with the ability to even manage some of the security risks that are on, embedded technologies on there. So whether that's, flash updates to firmware, whether that's password rotations, so some of the blocking and tackling of managing large, purpose-built devices that are prevalent throughout many industries, not just healthcare.
right. Well, let's talk a little bit about mapping the PHI. That's another one that sounds really scary to me.
So it is. It's a big job. And I've talked to a number of these technologies, particularly the passive tools, because they're essentially doing that. They can look at traffic, they can detect where it goes, they can determine what's normal traffic. Some of the encrypted traffic is a little trickier for them, but they know the data flows. And if they can develop the technologies on there, I think they can solve a portion of that problem for healthcare, for any organization, but healthcare delivery organizations, as we push into the clinical applications, that we use to support healthcare, whether it's your EHR, your PACS systems, whether those PACS systems are on-prem or in the cloud, that might become a little trickier, and we'll have to think about leaning into our business partners to do that half for us and let us know, what's going in. So I think that's a restructure of what we engage and how we engage with so many of the business partners that we rely on.
Are those the major, and I'm using the word scary, it works for me. Are those the major intimidating or concerning things that may come out in those HIPAA security rules, or is there anything else that you think will require a lot of effort?
No, so I think the pen testing, things like multi-factor authentication wherever possible, and a lot of this is zero trust basics,
Right.
that is or is not possible on a lot of the technologies. So understanding, where you can apply it and if it's applied, what's your organizational discipline for applying it where it can, these will be processes that will have to be worked over, and worked through, and it will take a little bit of time to figure that out, right?
Mhm.
And apply it. There is an expectation that, I think I read it was 60 days to, implement these things, which seems very like a very short time frame to manage all of this. The risk assessments, will require us to redo that. The GRC systems are good for recording, the risks that we have, but they're not really optimal tools for identifying the risks. Many of the IT tools look at the risk from an IT perspective, i.e., this vulnerability impacts this component, but it doesn't necessarily assess the impact on patient safety or data privacy or the ability to deliver healthcare services, which is the
Mhm.
three pillars of what we do in healthcare. And so we have to rethink, not just a risk assessment, in my opinion. We have to think about what's the impact assessment on that. And I've worked with many manufacturers and healthcare providers to look at that, to try to, come up with models that work within that framework, that helps them understand where the real priorities lie, in ensuring that you're able to deliver patient care even while under duress.
Excellent. All right, you brought up manufacturers. You'd earlier brought up the idea of requiring things in RFPs as a provider organization to your vendors. I want to challenge you a little bit on that. In certain scenarios. when I think of the large global medical device manufacturers, and what, how regimented they are and formalized they are, I'm not thinking they're going to care much about an order from a 300 bed health system. I just can't imagine that most health systems, maybe any health system, has any ability to sway some of these large manufacturers when there are maybe two or three in the world that provide the certain biomedical equipment you need to buy and that your clinicians have said they want. Like, let's say they want this one, right? So they don't even want one of these two or three. They want this one. It's a global company. You're a bug and they're a gorilla. And you're saying, hey, this is what the contract I need you to fill out. They're going to say, delete, Anyway, your thoughts on that?
So I think you're right. There's a lot of clinical need that drives the development of devices. I think the regulatory environment has, begun to gel up very nicely. We just had a town hall with the FDA, and they were telling us, some of the things that they still see as struggles. But as I talk with a lot of manufacturers, what I hear over and over again is their CI/CD, their secure software development programs, are really being driven into their quality. So they're beginning to step up, knowing that in order to get devices now approved, and particularly the new technologies that they would really like to sell to healthcare, that they have to first get them past regulatory agencies here, both in the United States or in Europe or in Japan, or in the Philippines. So I think we're seeing a lot of good work there. It does take some time to develop out of that, but we're changing it. And I think from a healthcare provider perspective, understanding that you're going to buy technology that is going to survive in your environment, for a number of years, and AHA's expected life minimum for a medical device is typically 7 years, if not 10 or 12. And we know that the life cycles between the components and the devices are often not aligned. And so selecting partners that will carry you into the future, that will make that investment with you, that will make the changes to their devices to keep them secure, is the kind of partnership you're looking for. Yes, they may not be able to solve every or provide every control that you would like today, but knowing that they're committed to that, knowing that they're committed to you as a partner, and this is not a transaction, is what's really going to move the sector. And I think what we'll begin to see is manufacturers coming out with devices that really make it untenable for healthcare delivery organizations to continue to operate older legacy devices that don't have this, because of the risk that those devices continue to expose their organization to. And so I think making smarter choices on the buying side, right? If it's not there today, don't purchase it today, wait until tomorrow, and you'll get what you need. I've worked with several manufacturers when I was in industry, to incrementally improve their devices over time, even before the FDA had its regulatory authority granted by 524B.
Yeah, it's really interesting. These decisions that, CISOs will weigh in on, and, not make solely, but weigh in on these, these are real legacy decisions. If you look at the average tenure of a CISO versus the average tenure of a medical device, that's quite, that's quite a gap. It's probably going to outlive you. You really have to look at what you're doing as being a steward of the organization and some of them have been around for 100 years plus. You have to think this stuff's going to outlive you, but it's not going to outlive the patients that this place takes care of. And you really have to look at it from a long term point of view. And you can't have that sort of short term, let's just get it, it's good enough for now, because you can't replace it when it's no longer good. So you really leave quite a legacy. It's interesting.
It is. And I think one of the things that has helped a lot is the board, the C-suite is now being held accountable for cybersecurity. What we're really talking about is a business risk, right? And this should be, I think it's misplaced to put the responsibility on the CISO. The CISO should be an internal advisor that helps you solve the technical challenges for the equipment that you want to bring into your environment. But you're looking at several factors. There's the clinical advantages that new technology have. There's the cost advantages, whether that's higher throughput, new procedures, even lower costs, right, for doing things. So the cybersecurity element is one piece of it, but it's an important element because it has a long-term, impact on the organization. So I think organizations that are, identifying this, getting the business leaders to sign off on the risks, right, and then having them commit to reducing those risks, within their individual business units is really what's doing that. They should be leaning into their CISOs and their tech teams to identify what are the possible solutions, what are the costs of those solutions, and then helping to support those solutions within their organization.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's touch on, see if you have any thoughts on the latest LLM developments around cybersecurity. We have Anthropic coming out with Project Glasswing and their Mythos tool. OpenAI has Daybreak and GPT 5.5 Cyber. These are being shared with limited partners on the technology side, the large technology companies that I suppose are using these tools to detect problems in their own software and get those fixed. And it's unclear, how those tools will be released, if at all, in any larger way. It creates, if they fall into the wrong hands, and there's been a story that someone tried to access it from Anthropic, and I don't know if they were unsuccessful. It's very gray. So obviously the bad guys want it. If the bad guys get it and only a few of the good guys have it, we're in big trouble. The more it's interesting, the more you disseminate these tools, you would think the greater the risk of it leaking to a bad actor. So right now, the CISOs at health systems don't have direct access to these things. I don't even know if they'd want them. So some of your vendors may have access, and are people going to start asking the question of their vendors, hey, have you been scanned? Have you scanned your tool? Do you have access? I want to know what level you're at, because it's going to be bifurcated. It's going to be, you've either not been scanned by one of these tools or you have been. If you have been, you're going to be put in a higher bucket of vetting and say, well, I know you're cleaner up here. So you could have a bifurcation of vendors based on how these private companies decide to disseminate this amazing tool. And you could have this be part of the software purchasing process. Could be an RFP. Have you been scanned by a Mythos class tool? This is all like up to the minute, right? I'm sure, you're drinking from a fire hose. We're all drinking from a fire hose. CISOs are drinking from a fire hose. Do you have any sort of high level thoughts on this and, of what you're hearing or what you're thinking?
So it's interesting because when I first read about Glasswing, what impressed me most was Anthropic's marketing of this whole thing. DARPA H, their AI cyber challenge, their AIxCC that they awarded, they had a 2-year challenge to do exactly the same thing. So they were using the tools from Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, even Anthropic, in this competition, this 2-year competition, where 7 finalist teams detected 77% of the known vulnerabilities in this huge code set, and they developed patches for 61% of them, so this is a capability that's been around for a while. We have, vibe coding where, software engineers are now, or even non-engineers are developing code to do certain things. It's a natural, I think, progression of technology. This stuff, while exorbitantly expensive today and probably making it exclusive, will become common. for that. And it won't be long before has to be in the arsenal of every operator, not only to, scan their edge from the outside and see if there are holes available, even through vulnerability chaining, but also to scan their technologies from the inside, and find out where we're at. Because one of the things that AI has done is made, has changed the whole identity and access management, because once it's in, it's mutable. It can modify itself. So, we're seeing technology shifts that are just amazing. We're going to have to, lean on this. I think what we'll see as this becomes common for attackers, the capability will be there for defenders as well. So that's been, almost the continuous cycle of the attack and defend thing. As attackers gain new techniques, we develop defenses for them.
Mhm.
Whether we'll be able to do that at machine speed, and not human speed is going to be the real trick. It's going to force us to rethink how we do it. And I'm a clinical engineer. That's a little outside of my expertise of what that might look like, but it's, clear that it has to be done, and we're going to have to adapt it, make those investments. I think some of the HIPAA security rules will, the ePHI mapping will help make that, more real, and also make that more necessary for, healthcare delivery or any organization, really.
I had always thought that, the social engineering was sort of the hacking or the cyber threat that anyone could do, right? Anybody can do social engineering. You can do research online about someone and try and figure out who the right person is and do so. You don't have to be a computer wizard to do social engineering and try and get someone's password. But in order to sort of do a pure sort of network level or medical device, coming through a printer or an operational technology, you got to be pretty sophisticated. But now, I would think that AI and these tools, if they leak into the wrong hands, that takes that all away. You don't need the sophistication you used to do a sort of more technology focused attack. You just need the tool, and then it can find all the vulnerabilities in these sophisticated. It can get around the network segmentation. It can do all the stuff that the average person could never do. So it changes the threat landscape. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And we've been seeing this evolution for a number of years on here, and quite honestly, when we do cyber training, what we need to focus on is getting folks to be critical thinkers, if you will, to begin to question everything on that. It's the only way. The human is the weakest link, and the way to strengthen that is through critical thought. Is this real? We used to, and then you have to, we used to ask, is this the truth? And now we have to ask, is this real, because of that? And it's on every level. And it's a challenge, because especially in healthcare, I think because we're a trusting, nurturing, caring community, that doesn't think attack first. And so we just need to raise awareness amongst all our staff without turning them into cyber experts. They have full-time jobs that are pretty darn complicated. And the real thing is just getting them to question that, and then turning it over to the experts and really driving the IT security, the clinical engineering teams that respond, to think cyber first, not just user error or a device failure.
Anything more specific on medical device security? We've talked about some broad stuff. That are it's on the top of your mind that you want to touch on?
I think the one thing we need to do is somehow get past the patching at speed.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest challenge. The lag between vulnerability discovery and patch availability and applicability is just far too long in today's current LLM and AI world. It's just not no longer sustainable. It's not going to be there. I think that's the real key. I don't, I think we can test it on the non-regulated devices, the non-regulated IoT and OT devices in a healthcare environment, things like, access controls, camera systems, air handlers, things, even refrigerators, temperature sensors, Coke machines, things that may not have an impact or direct impact, on patient care, that we can test the capabilities, test the technology, make sure that it fits within our work streams, understand how that can work, and then apply it deeper and more effectively into the regulated and, let's say, the more personally, or let's say from a safety perspective, impactful devices that are medical devices.
All right, very good. Let's touch on, I'm not going to keep you too much longer, but one of the issues that the actual CISOs ask about during our discussions and our webinars when they get a chance to talk to each other is about reporting structures and governance and biomedical engineering and clinical engineering and where they report to. Do they report to facilities? Do they report to IT? Do they report to cybersecurity? That seems to be an area that's been in flux and it's been changing, sort of seems to be a trend of moving out of facilities under IT. I wanted your thoughts on what you're seeing, if you see any trends, and do you think there's a preferred model that works the best?
So I do. I think the evolution is necessary. Biomeds used to be part of the facilities team, and as devices became more and more software enabled, then they kind of broke away and became their own group, and they were still taking care of beds that are digitally enabled today. The OR lights, are the comm center for a surgery suite. So these kinds of evolutions are natural. What we're seeing a lot of is they're now aligned with the IT groups, and I think that's a good place to be. But what I see that really works is when IT begins to embed their talent into the clinical engineering groups and even into the facilities groups to do two things. One, bring that expertise in, but also understand, better the clinical environment. Biomeds serve an incredibly useful purpose within healthcare because they can translate technology, what the device does, how it's interoperable, what it takes to keep it maintained and functioning, right? And they can translate that to the clinical staff in terms that they understand. I always thought that it was that IT having their own risk assessment tools and their own risk assessment process outside of the environment of care was a mistake, because the environment of care is how the rest of healthcare manages risk within the organization. And healthcare is nothing but risk management, So I think that interleave, we have to, create that tapestry where these teams are working together. Biomeds, and IT are culturally very different. A biomed is a firefighter, and it's usually a one-to-one interaction, and it's usually a patient safety issue that they're after and operational. So the device fails, they go fix that device, they move on to the next device. Where with IT, one change can impact several hundred, several thousand people. It's a one-to-many relationship, and that's culturally necessary, but it creates a friction that only by embedding and having that understanding between how the two teams function can really drive the necessary interactions and cooperation that's necessary to build the teams, to make them functional, and more importantly, help them build a more resilient ecosystem within their organizations.
That's great. Just a quick follow-up and then I'll let you go. Regarding embedding, can you tell me what that looks like? Are there varieties of how you do that? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so sometimes it's as simple as putting an IT security analyst in the biomed shop, and they're going out and helping the biomeds understand some of the challenges of updating devices, of patching devices, of even making connections, how to do this. When we talk about uptimes for medical devices, your manufacturers are giving you 99.9 or 99.8% uptime. So they're guaranteeing this. And then you get to the interoperability piece, and we've got an SLA for connectivity that allows a 24-hour response, which is just not acceptable in a healthcare environment, particularly, a high risk or a high patient safety healthcare environment. And so by putting folks into that environment, then they can tap into the right resources in the IT teams to bring that conversation there. They've got the language that triggers the right things. The clinical engineers are helping translate those conversations. It's one of the things we do at Health-ISAC. When there's an alert that comes out and it says this vulnerability will allow a threat actor to change the operating parameters or own the device or change the data that comes off the device. So we take that and we say, well, what does that mean clinically? And then we translate that. So we'll say we'll put in there, that means that the bad actor could make your device unavailable, or it doesn't operate the way you expect it to. You will not get the output that you would anticipate, or that the data could change and could no longer be trusted and you'd have to rerun it, so that you might, generate a patient safety issue, or you might delay treatment or have a misdiagnosis. And so we translate that IT speak into clinical impacts in a way that resonates with them and really helps the clinicians understand and prioritize, what needs to be done, how quickly, what they need to think about on that.
All right, Phil, listen, this was excellent. That's about all we had time for today. I really appreciate your time, a valuable conversation, and I hope we can catch up with you again down the road. So thank you very much.
You bet. Well, thank you, Anthony, and I would look forward to another conversation.
Have a great day.
You bet. You as well.